Hello, Wow, I gotta clap, man. Goddamn ants. I don't know how they got in here. Welcome everybody to another episode of Convoluted. I'm Jesse Asher, and today we're gonna talk about a Haitian immigrant who was wrongfully convicted for a rape that he did not do. And as always, I'll post my links below that I used. So in the early morning hours, around 4:30 a.m., 5 a.m. on May 29th, 1989 in Orlando, Florida, a Puerto Rican woman was dragged behind some bushes, held at some sort of weapon point. They didn't know which kind of weapon. It was some metal object. And she was dragged behind some shrubbery, and she was unfortunately raped and sexually assaulted. Though she was able to escape, and unfortunately she was also still nude. So she ran to a house where a Good Samaritan by the name of Sherman Williams actually gave her a robe to cover up, and then he proceeded to call the authorities. So the authorities showed up, and she provided a description of her attacker, but she refused to go to the hospital and refused to go to the police station, and also refused to provide a rape kit. So hours after arriving home and cleaning up and everything, her and some of her family members, they got into a car and they went back to the area that she was attacked to look for her attacker. And that's when they noticed a young man who was walking to work, where he worked at a car dealership, around 7 a.m. a couple hours later. And this young man is who she claimed to be her attacker. So police were called, and this is when the man that she accused, Jules Letemps, who was a 26-year-old immigrant from Haiti, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing his name wrong since he's from Haiti. It's probably more French sounding, but I'm just gonna say Jules Letemps so I don't try to butcher it. They arrested Jules Letemps for 3 counts of sexual assault and 1 count of kidnapping. So due to the fact that the victim was limited in English, police called in a Spanish-speaking officer to take her statement. All the sources that I read stated that the victim said that the attacker was short, black, male, and in blue jeans and a two-toned or multicolored shirt. And even though our victim was also a limited English speaker, Jules Letemps, being a Haitian immigrant, he also spoke very little English, and since his native language was Creole. So remember that I stated that she refused to provide a rape kit and wouldn't go to the police station or the hospital. Because of all that, they didn't really have any DNA evidence to go off, except they did have a semen stain on the robe that was provided to the victim by that Good Samaritan, Sherman Williams. And when she got home, she discarded that robe in her trash. So that was all they had for evidence, really. And then in November of 1989, Jules Letemps goes to trial in Orange County, Florida. And the trial, according to my sources, lasted 2 days. And here's a little side note, fun fact, not really fun fact, I guess, but little side fact, according to Centurion Ministries, Orange County, Florida was actually the first state to use DNA to convict a rapist, and that was in 1987. So they tested the small evidence that they did actually have, and the Florida Department Law Enforcement technician Nancy Rotman used a method called serology, or blood type evidence. And I'm just going to quote a definition of serology from Johns Hopkins. Quote, "Serology is the study of blood serum, the clear fluid that separates when blood clots. In a secretor, according to Centurion Ministries, quote, someone who secretes blood type indicators in their bodily fluids," unquote. This method of serology is limited to the status of the secretor. In Nancy Rotman's report, she stated the semen concentration was too low to provide a conclusive solution or conclusive information about the source of the semen. Both Jules, his roommate, and his partner, who he actually had 3 children with, testified that Jules was at home sleeping before one of them woke him up to get ready for work around 6:30 a.m. 6:30 a.m. would have been about an hour and a half or so after the attack. And of course, Jules Letemps also testified and denied involvement, although he did admit to threatening the victim, but he claimed it was because, essentially it seemed like he was frightened and scared because she was accusing him of something that he didn't do, or he claimed he didn't do. And the victim identified Jules Letemps, as the attacker, and she claimed that when she pointed at Letemps, he threatened to kill her. So here's an important detail and factor to this case. Jules' home was south of the crime scene, and his workplace was actually north of the crime scene. Because of that test that Nancy, the technician from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, came back as inconclusive according to her. The only thing they had going really at trial was the victim's identification. And so here's the issue with the direction in which Jules was walking. Officer Ford falsely testified stating that Jules Letemps was actually walking southbound in the direction of his home. But in his initial report, he stated that Jules was walking northbound in the direction of his work. And that's a pretty major discrepancy. Jules' attorney failed to protest or object to Officer Ford's inconsistencies with his report and testimony. In fact, the defense didn't cross-examine any of the officers who testified. Therefore, the jury actually believed that Jules was walking home away from the crime scene instead of believing the alibi of waking up later at around 6:30 and walking north to his workplace. And even though the serology test was shown to be inconclusive by Nancy Rotman, it also meant that they could not exclude Jules Letemps. So the counsel then moved to suppress that evidence, and the jury was told that it was inconclusive. And Jules Letemps was found guilty and convicted of 3 counts of sexual assault, 1 count of kidnapping, and he was sentenced to 4 consecutive terms of life in prison. If you remember earlier, I mentioned that Jules Letemps was pretty limited in his English speaking skills, and so while in prison, he would actually receive help from other inmates to file his numerous post-conviction petitions, but they were all unsuccessful and failed. And according to the National Registry of Exonerations, Letemps reached out to the Florida Innocence Project in 2003, but once the Florida Innocence Project learned the evidence had been destroyed in 1997, which meant no DNA could be tested, they took no further action on the case at the time. And then in 2010, Centurion Ministries, a nonprofit organization based in New Jersey, they put Kate Germond and Paul Castellero, I'm probably butchering that. They put them on the case and they started looking into his case. So Castellero discovered a cassette tape of pre-trial depositions that actually hadn't been transcribed in the prosecution's files. So do you remember that semen stain analysis that Florida Department of Law Enforcement technician Nancy Rotman decided was inconclusive? Well, one of those depositions that hadn't been transcribed in the prosecution's files was actually Nancy Rotman explaining to Letemps' attorney about the testing procedures that she had used to analyze that semen stain. So because of that, Centurion? They proved through a nationally known and recognized serology expert and the company SERI, that Nancy Rotman's test was actually done incorrectly. And after reviewing the transcription, they found that she had used the wrong standard to calculate the concentration of semen on the stain in that robe. Her calculation using the incorrect standard resulted in too small of a semen sample to properly obtain the blood type indicators. Jules Letemps, he was blood type B, and he was also a secretor. So if they had used the correct standard, or if she had used the correct standard, she would have found that the concentration amount was high enough to conclude that no blood type B indicators were in the semen sample, which meant it excluded Jules Letemps. So to make that clear, it wasn't his semen stain. It was not his DNA, according to the proper standards. Therefore, Centurion rounded up multiple experts in serology to examine Nancy Rotman's lab notes and the transcription of the deposition she gave to prove that she had used the wrong standard. With that evidence, Centurion actually filed another motion for post-conviction relief, and they did so with the help of Seth Miller, the executive director from the Florida Innocence Project. But unfortunately, that motion was denied. Then Centurion filed a writ of habeas corpus with the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. And on July 20th, 2015, the U.S. District Court Judge Presnell granted the writ and ordered a new trial. So that judge, he then ruled that Jules's trial attorney provided inadequate legal defense by failing to investigate Rotman's analysis, and also showed criticism for the lack of his lawyers to cross-examine the officer who reported inconsistent stories about where Letemps was walking in which direction. According to the National Registry of Exoneration, Judge Presnell said, quote, "When confronted with this evidence, no reasonable juror would have convicted Letemps." unquote. And the state did not appeal Judge Presnell's decisions, and the case went back to Orlando for retrial. And during that retrial, 3 nationally recognized serology experts testified that Jules Letemps was excluded from that sample to a scientific certainty. And on October 14th, 2016, the prosecution dismissed the charges against Jules Letemps. And I'm going to quote something that Seth Miller, the executive director of the Florida Innocence Project, said from the Orlando Sentinel. Quote, "Letemps' case is your very prototypical wrongful conviction case from the 70s, 80s, or 90s," unquote. You would think this would be the end of it and that this is like a big win, but unfortunately, Jules actually had to remain in custody because he was facing deportation back to Haiti for a 30-year-old drug charge that he had prior to any of this. And Jules had actually left Haiti when he was 17, and he moved to Florida on humanitarian parole, which according to the Marshall Project, it is a temporary status granted to those fleeing their country for urgent humanitarian reasons. Therefore, after the conviction for the rape, immigration officials revoked his parole. And also, according to the Marshall Project, there is no statute of limitations on immigration law, or at least at this time there wasn't. And Letemps' lawyer, John Pratt, offered a couple arguments against his deportation. And the first one being that, quote, "sending the man back to Haiti would be an act of cruelty amounting to torture," unquote. And that's due to the conditions of living there in Haiti, but more specifically the conditions for deportees when they are sent back. It's not, I mean, I could go into more detail about that, but for time's sake I won't. But it's not a good situation. It's arguably worse, if not worse, than just being in the prison here. And the second argument was that, quote, "letting Letemps stay would be a proper compensation for the 27 years he spent wrongfully imprisoned," unquote. I also wanted to note that most of his family lived in the United States and were naturalized citizens. So if he were to go back to Haiti, he wouldn't really have any family or anything there anyway. And unfortunately, a lot of his family members have died while he was imprisoned. One last sad note, all of my sources were pretty much published no later than 2017, or all the ones I could find. And so I honestly have no idea if he was actually deported or if he was able to stay. I just couldn't find anything on it. I searched as much as I could search. I even tried to figure out how to look at records of people that were deported. Don't know if I missed something, I just couldn't figure it out. So if anybody does know how to do that or how to figure out if he actually was deported, please let me know, because I would love to figure that out. And I can always do a little update. So I hate to do that to you guys, and I wish I could provide a better conclusion, but I just couldn't find it. I would love for you guys to check out all my sources that I've used. Be sure to read the Marshall Project's article about Jules Letemps. It was a really good read. It shouldn't take you too long. I want to thank you guys for making it to the end of this video, and make sure to do all the follows and subscribes and share and etc. Raise awareness. Make sure you stay tuned for more Convoluted episodes, and more importantly, make sure to check out Centurion Ministries and the Florida Innocence Project. I will link both of them below. You can always read about more cases, you can donate, you can volunteer, you can raise awareness and just talk about it. And of course, I've got to mention the National Registry of Exonerations, because that's one of the main sources I use, and they are the catalog basically for exonerees. Just got a whole list. So make sure to check out their link below as well. Vielen Dank, Auf Wiedersehen, and have a good day or night, wherever you are.